Sinead O'Connor won the 1991 Grammy Award for Best Alternative Music Performance, only to boycott the award ceremony, criticizing its commercialism. In an interview with Rolling Stone, she said, "It's not like I got up in the morning and said, okay, now let's start a new controversy. It just so happens that what I do naturally causes trouble." But her Grammy Awards boycott was nothing compared to the uproar the next year during her musical performance on Saturday Night Live, where the then 25-year-old sang an a cappella version of Bob Marley's War, which she concluded by ripping apart a photograph of Pope John Paul II and uttering the unforgettable line, "Fight the real enemy." The act was in defiance of the Catholic Church's tolerance of child sexual abuse by church leaders, years before that conversation reached the level of prevalence it has today. The backlash against her was overwhelming. But even before her statement against pedophilia on national television, she made a statement against the sexist standards of the music industry by shaving her head, and had a track record of speaking out in support of women's rights, abortion, and anti-racism. She didn't identify herself as a pop star, but rather as a protest singer. In her Rolling Stone interview, she said, "I'm a proud troublemaker, but I would call her a transgressor, someone who defiantly challenged unjust rules despite the consequences." This morning's reading is a story about two transgressors, Shiphrah and Puah. It takes place during a time when the leader of the country had forgotten his history, a history in which the Israelite Joseph had once saved Egypt from starvation. Now, several centuries later, Pharaoh, concerned as he was at the growing number of Israelites, enslaved them and tried working them into submission. But that had no effect on the growing population of Israelites. So Pharaoh resorted to murder, ordering the Hebrew wives to kill all male Israelite babies at birth. Apparently, he felt he had nothing to fear from the girl babies. But the irony is that it's the girls and the women in this story who undermined his plans. Shiphrah and Puah refused to obey his command, and in so doing, they broke the law and accepted their roles as transgressors. They answered to a higher authority than the ruler of Egypt. They answered to God and to their own good conscience. They were in the business of life and not death. They disobeyed the law, and then they lied about it, saying the Hebrew women gave birth before the midwives could get to them. And according to the text, God rewarded them for their actions. It's worth considering the midwives these two women may have inspired when word began to spread through the grapevine about their defiant action. One commentator reminds us that all the boys during that time may have been saved because of the choices made by Shiphrah and Puah and their like-minded midwife colleagues. It's reasonable that many who fled Egypt with Moses would do so because of midwives like Shiphrah and Puah. Those Hebrews who will live through the wilderness journey, those who, along with their children, will settle in the land of promise, may owe their survival and existence to midwives like Shiphrah and Puah. Systems of power are usually built on unjust laws. And when that happens, God steps in, acting through transgressors who are willing to accept the risks and consequences of speaking out and acting on behalf of the oppressed. And when we come face to face with those transgressors, we also come face to face with the God of justice. It was on February 1st, 1960, that the God of justice acted through 4 black students who sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and ordered coffee. As Time magazine reported it, the white waitress ignored their studiously polite requests for service. The 4 young men remained seated until closing time, but returned with 300 more students a few days later, determined to integrate the whites-only 5 and dime. The sit-in attracted sympathy from white college students, and soon picketers began to march outside of Woolworth's and variety stores in other cities, leading to Woolworth's desegregation in July of 1960, with other stores and restaurants following suit. The lunch counter sit-ins led to wade-ins at pools and beaches, kneel-ins at churches, read-ins at libraries, and walk-ins at theaters and amusement parks. Despite the verbal and physical harassment from white people, the strategy often worked. Those 4 black students and the hordes of protesters their action inspired were transgressors who resisted the unjust social structures of their day and who I believe received a nod of approval from God. You will always encounter God in acts of resistance against unjust laws. But it won't be the kind of encounter you may be accustomed to when you find God in the beauty of nature or when you settle into a time of prayer or meditation. Your spirit won't soar as on eagle's wings as it might when you're struck by the chords and lyrics of a familiar hymn. Instead, you may experience feelings of fear for your own safety or anger at the needless suffering of your neighbor. You may feel overwhelmed by the chaos that threatens to engulf you or the backlash against your act of resistance. Encounters with God aren't always marked by rainbows and daffodils. Sometimes they're marked by acts of courage and tears of rejection. But please know that when I speak of acts of resistance, I'm not referring to the statements of outrage posted on social media that call out the behavior of politicians who will never see or hear of those posts. And I'm not talking about signing one's name to the dozens of petitions that fill your email inbox because we've seen that lawmakers ignore them, regardless of the number of names on those petitions. I'm not even talking about the peaceful gatherings of solidarity like the one that took place yesterday downtown protesting gun violence. If I'm honest and realistic, I suspect not one single gun death will be impacted by that gathering. None of these are actions that involve risk, sacrifice, or courage. I'm talking about civil disobedience, active refusal by a transgressor to obey the unjust demands of an authority in power. Jesus was a transgressor. Martin Luther King Jr. was a transgressor. So was Sinead O'Connor, and so were 4 college students at a 5 and dime store. And so were 2 midwives who just kept doing what they had always done, bringing life into the world. Be on the lookout, my friends. And when you see an opportunity to act in a way that says no to injustice, then do it. If you're afraid to do it on your own, do it with like-minded people. Do it, and you will experience God in a way that you have never experienced them before. Amen.